Let's now talk about restarting India. We've been running a series here on CNN News 18 about rebooting India. The Prime Minister laid out his vision for an Atmanirbhar Bharat. But the reality is we've grown at 4.2% in the last financial year, which is the slowest that India has grown in over a decade. Joining us now for the road ahead is the Chief Economic Advisor to the Finance Ministry, Mr. K.V. Subramanian. Thank you very much for speaking with us, Mr. Subramanian. Let me start off with, the bad news, which was the GDP numbers that came out last Friday, 4.2% for the last financial. Was this in line with your expectations? And if that's the case, even before the pandemic and the lockdown hit, what are your expectations for this financial year, where at least the first quarter will be almost a near washout?
Firstly, I think it's important to keep in mind that the growth for the last quarter was affected by the uncertainty due to the pandemic itself. We've analyzed various high-frequency indicators, and if you look at in terms of railway travel, flights or electricity generation and a bunch of other measures, around February itself, many of these measures started declining because of the uncertainty stemming from the COVID pandemic. And it is also important to keep in mind that around February, many of the indicators, for instance, the PMI for services or that for manufacturing, was starting to look up. So the growth for Q4 coming lower is primarily or one of the key contributors to that has been the uncertainty due to the pandemic.
But the Q4 did not have the lockdown or the shutdown, certainly not the full impact of it. It was only from the 25th of March or so. For this quarter of this financial year, Q1, where, you've had all of April shut, large parts of May shut, and June we're beginning to open up. What's your assessment of how we're going to begin this year?
Yeah, that's why, Zaka, I was saying that even though the actual shutdown was only from the 22nd of March when the Janata curfew was announced, the uncertainty, because of the pandemic had started pulling down consumption and investment, etc., starting from February itself. So that's important to keep in mind. Yes, Q1, numbers will be actually, will be negative because of the lockdown, effect of the lockdown. I would maintain that there's significant uncertainty when we look at the growth for this particular financial year. It will depend very, very critically on whether there is a growth spurt in the second half of the year or not, which itself will depend on how long the pandemic continues, because the uncertainty due to the pandemic, has an impact on demand, especially for the discretionary items, because of what we economists call the precautionary motive to save. Till that uncertainty persists, and because the uncertainty stems from the health side, it's very hard to actually predict when will the pandemic or the uncertainty due to the pandemic, when will it end? And that's what will affect the demand for the discretionary items.
Most assessments, the IMF has perhaps the most optimistic assessment, which is at least positive growth. But most agencies, international ratings agencies, seem to suggest that it will be negative growth for the full year. Do you have any assessment based on what we are seeing over these first 3 months of this year as to whether we will at least get to positive territory by the end of this financial year?
We had our assessment, early on in the lockdown, early on, just about, first few weeks of April, we had assessed at that time to be, between 1.5 to 2% was what we had assessed, which was based on the, on the expectation of a V-shaped recovery in the second half of this year, which itself, was derived from the fact that if we look at the previous pandemic, which was the Spanish flu episode, which was far more devastating, almost 10 times odd greater, in terms of its rate of infection, and 3 times more, mortality rate, yet it was a V-shaped recovery. So based on that, the assessment was of a V-shaped recovery in the second half of the year.
There is some concern that's been expressed by, particularly by ratings agencies, and not just around the pandemic, about, fundamentals. For example, Moody's has just recently downgraded India for the first time in more than 20 years, and they have said, and I quote, the longer and broader the economic slowdown, the more pain it will be for the Indian economy. How are you sure that, once the fears around the pandemic go away, we will see a V-shaped recovery, or we will see better days ahead in the second half? Because most international institutions seem to think that this is a far more widespread and perhaps even a structural slowdown that we're seeing.
So there are a few points here that Zakai actually want to mention. In the economic survey that was tabled in Parliament on 31st of January, we had done a very careful analysis of the reasons for the slowdown. And what we had concluded there was this slowdown originates from the bad loans that were done in the financials, in the banking sector. And this is a overhang of that, because the risk aversion that you're seeing, which has then affected credit, is also stemming from the measures that were taken following that. So the slowdown does not originate from real sector issues, more from the financial sector issues, and we had actually shown it with very careful analysis. So that's something which is important to remember. If it is due to, let's say, structural problems on the real side, then yes, some of the assessments I think there I would agree with, but this is coming from the financial side.
Okay, let's talk about the financial sector for one second, because okay, go ahead. Okay, finish your point. Yeah.
Because there are a couple of points that must be kept in mind. Rating agencies, if you look at following the COVID episode, about 33 countries have been downgraded. Themselves have done them. So this is something that must be kept in mind. The perspective. Also, if you look at we've done this analysis as well. Eventually, a rating is an assessment of it's a mapping of the probability of default on a loan. This is where my view is that the probability of default itself is based on the willingness to repay and the ability to repay. On both counts, India distinguishes itself from other countries because we've never ever defaulted on any loan. Last point being, we basically have looked at the at debt sustainability. And what we have seen is, yes, this year growth will actually be very tepid. I think everybody acknowledges,
sure,
including me. From next year onwards, the growth, as long as it is 4% plus, debt will be sustainable.
Okay, tell me this. Now, one of the decisions that has been taken by the government is for MSME loans, asking banks to extend loans. We already know, the legacy of the NPA problem. I'm not getting into that. Convince our viewers on two counts. One, why this would not lead to a further aggravation of the NPA problem, because eventually at some point somebody's got to repay this money. And two, why should banks, which are anyway risk averse, start lending more and be more open to taking risk just because government is giving them a backstop?
So in fact, I think you've partly answered the question yourself with the last part of your question, which is because of the backstop and especially the 100% guarantee. There is no risk involved in the 3 lakh crore that lending the lending that is to be done to the MSMEs. And risk aversion actually in its own term, it's aversion to risk. If there is no risk because it's a 100% guaranteed loan, then the aversion to risk cannot actually manifest. So that's point number one. Point number two, given the several reforms measures that have been implemented, these are second generation reforms on the product market and the factor market side, we will expect productivity improvements. And so by the time when these loans come back for repayment, by that time measures would have fructified, and so some of the stress actually may not be as bad as
okay. I got two final questions. One on, the criticism from the opposition has been, why didn't you put money directly in the hands of people? Why aren't you, churning demand by directly putting money into the hands of people? You've instead asked for liquidity support. So please respond to that criticism.
Two key points on that. First, as I was mentioning earlier, it is important to keep the nuance aspect of demand in mind. I think, demand has both the discretionary and the non-discretionary items to it. Because of the precautionary motive to save, the demand for discretionary items will actually continue to be tepid. And even, a cash transfer may not actually have an impact on that. And the evidence of that is, if you look at the PMJDY balances, the Jan Dhan Yojana, these are basically, accounts for the bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah.
The balances there have increased by 18,000 crores since the lockdown. And if you take the 40,000 crore, 40 crores accounts that there are, 450 rupees is the average increase in balances. So this is important to keep in mind. Second, when you think about when you look at other countries, the measure has been a combination of fiscal, monetary, liquidity, and forbearance. Every country has done this. The portfolio actually has varied depending on where there is greater space.
Okay.
And this is something I'll end with. The Chinese Premier Deng Xiaoping used to say, "I don't care about the color of the cat as long as it catches mice." Same, is the way I think about it. As long as actually these measures are intended to take care of the MSMEs and those who actually provide employment, whether it comes from the fiscal or from the monetary or liquidity or forbearance, I basically don't see the distinction. What is most important is to actually provide the support that these MSMEs need, which is something we've done.
Thank you very much, Mr. K.V. Subramanian, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Appreciate you joining us and giving us your thoughts and perspectives. All right, from rebooting the economy back to the pandemic now, and one very interesting strain of thought that's come to light, and this has come to light in Italy, is that doctors there have found that the strain, the COVID-19 strain, or the SARS-CoV-2 as it's known, was much more potent, much more lethal back in March. It's sort of petered out now. This is a study that's been found in Italy. Is there any truth to that? Let me now go across to Dr. Oscar